Chapter 1. Torsten sat in the window seat in his bedroom. Half of the stained glass window was flung open, and sitting so near the window, he gave the whole court something to see. His beauty was rare and rich, as he was the youngest son of the king and queen. He was a prince. However, he had a very different fate from the other princes of the kingdom. He shook out his blonde hair, blinked his coppery eyes, and hated everyone so thoroughly it should have melted the glass in front of his eyes and burned the seat under his bottom. The hate flared through him so utterly that it should have caused him to spit acid, breathe fire, and puke poison. However, nothing happened. Instead, he sat there and the world stayed the same around him. The world did not care if it was unfair to him. The wind still blew, the sun still shone, and flecks of dust hung in the air like time stood still. For everyone else, it was an ordinary day, but not for him. For him, it might be the last night he slept in his bedroom. Ever since Torsten was a little boy, he had known he was different from his older brothers. They were trained to fight as knights, and given lessons in strategy so that they might lead armies. In contrast, Torsten was taken with his sisters to have his hands groomed. When he was little, he thought it was because he was too young to engage in warfare, but as he grew older, his schedule didn't change. Instead of being taught how to sharpen a sword, he was taught how to read and write. Not just the basics, but how to read aloud well and how to write in long curling letters. When he was 13, he was sent to apprentice to a painter to learn how to paint. He would have liked it better if his brothers had been included in the exercise, but instead, they were beating dummies in the courtyard while he was instructed to keep his hands free of paint and kept apart from them. The only lessons he was allowed to attend along with them were the riding lessons. He was taught alongside them how to groom and care for a horse. It was then that he realized that he was 3 inches taller than his older brother. He would have realized it sooner, but they rarely stood side by side. "Mother, why am I not being trained in warfare? I have a better body than Callum," he complained. "I can see the top of his head." She turned and looked at him with sorrowing eyes. "Darling, this is a special time that you get to spend with me." Torsten did a double take. He was 14 years old, and it had never occurred to him that no matter what activity he did, he was always kept close to his mother. He had sisters. They were near her too, but not as close. If his mother reached out at any given time, she could touch him. He sat next to her at the dinner table. His room was closer to hers than any of his other siblings. He would have asked his father his question, except he rarely saw him. He was off with Torsten's brothers. Something was wrong. Maybe, he had always known something was wrong. But he hadn't discovered what it was until the day he spat hatred out his bedroom window. He was 19. He was more than a man, and his clean hands painted and wrote. His trained voice spoke and sang. His gloved hands handled a horse well, and his clothes were unstained in his own blood, which set him apart from his brothers. Earlier that day, the answer to Torsten's evaded question had been revealed. A bird had arrived at the watchtower. They used carrier pigeons and falcons at the castle, but the bird that perched on the battlements was neither. This bird was yellow with a long tail like a flag, black stripes on its face, and black blots on the tips of its wings. At its arrival, Torsten's mother fainted and the truth came out. She was taken straight to her bed, and the king took Torsten to the armory, a place he had never been admitted to before. He didn't know what his father was going to say, but he knew that the bird meant the time he had to spend with his mother was over. All children had to part from their parents at some point. Some were sent to rule smaller parts of the kingdom, some were married off in diplomatic alliances, and some, well, a lot died. He knew he had a sibling who had died, a younger brother who hadn't quite made it. Torsten barely remembered him. What would have happened if his little brother had lived? Would Torsten have avoided the fate of the youngest son? Would Torsten have been taught to fight with his older brothers instead of learning to paint? Inside the armory, the king closed the door to give them privacy. He was a gruff man with a strong voice, but no way with words. He began by saying something neutral. That bird was more than an omen. It was a message with no parchment attached to its ankle. Its arrival itself was enough to convey the message. "Do you know what it means?" Torsten shook his head wordlessly. His father looked sorry.
The
Sorry
extra
for
tale
everything.
in the
But he
fairy
wasn't a
tale.
coward, and he
The
explained.
truth was that the
In all our
king,
fuss
who
about
had once
warfare
been
and
Prince
defending our
Rollo,
kingdom,
had been so
have you ever
enraged
noticed
that
that we
his
are never
parents
attacked
had
from the
given his
north?
brother, Callison,
Torsten had
to
not
the hollow
noticed.
man for their
They fought the
sacrifice that he
barbarians
had
to the
stormed
east
out
and
of
the
the
pagans to
castle,
the south,
mounted his
and they had an
horse,
alliance
and
with the
given them
mustards to the
chase into
west.
the north
But he had
woods.
never even
He
thought that
knew
they
he could
faced a
catch
possible
up to the 2
invasion to the
dragons
north.
and the knight if he
The land
hurried.
northward was
He
wilderness,
had no
thick
fear of
forests,
slaying 2
jagged
dragons
mountains,
or of killing the
wild
knight
beasts,
who had
and
come to
monsters
take his
everywhere.
brother. One
"If you need
night was
every
only one
soldier,
night,
father,
and he
I am
had
ready
already
to fight,"
vanquished a fair
Torsten
few
said
on the
roughly,
field of battle.
trying to echo the way his
However,
father spoke instead of the way
even
his
though
mother
he
had
saw
taught
the
him to
place
speak.
where the procession of
The
2
king's
entered the
unsettled eyes
forest,
rested on
even though
Torsten's
he
copper
dove in
ones, and he
straight after
slowly
them,
looked down at his
even though
frame until
everything
his
should
gaze
have made
lingered on his
sense,
son's boots.
nothing did.
He put a
Within
hand
10
on his
minutes
shoulder.
of entering the
I see that
forest,
you have been raised
Prince
properly by your
Rollo
mother.
was completely
I couldn't be
lost.
prouder that those
Not
words
only
are the
could
ones
he
you
not
chose
find
as
the
a
knight and his
response.
brother,
It
but
is
very
true that I will
soon
need you
it
in our
became
dealings with
obvious
the
that he
Northern
would not be
Kingdom.
able to find his way
Torsten's
out of the
chest
woods.
swelled with pride.
What then began
Finally,
was
he was
something
going to
more
get what he had
harrowing than
always
anything the
desired,
prince
a
had
place
seen on
with
the
his father and
battlefield.
brothers.
He was trapped
But
in
we
the
will not need
forest
to
for
fight
6
them,
weeks
his father
before he
said
found his
slowly.
way out.
That isn't
In the
how we deal with
meantime,
them.
he had
Something
to kill
caught in
and eat
Torsten's
monsters he'd
throat.
never
How do
seen
we deal with
before.
them?
He
His
used his
father's
cape
eyes
to hang
glazed
from a
over in
sturdy
something
tree
like a
branch
stupor.
to make a
They
kind of
asked us to
hammock.
sacrifice one
He
of our
had to
princes
sit
to them
up
once a
inside it to
generation.
sleep. He also
Torsten's
had
eyes
to
went
map the
wide.
entire
It was going to
forest,
be him.
but that
It was
never
always
helped.
going to be him.
He found
He
his
backed
way
away
out
from
of
his
the
father,
forest one
taking
day
2 steps
completely
before
by
he got a grip
accident.
on himself
On
and
his
cleared his
arrival
throat.
back home, his
They're going to
father,
kill me.
the king at
I
that
don't
time,
know, his
beat
father
him
said,
soundly
shaking
and
his
used him
head
as an
like a dazed
example to the
person.
entire royal
I know
family
that my
that war
father
with the
sent my
Hollow Men
brother
was
away with their
suicide.
knight.
Not
The
only
knight came
that,
in the
but
heaviest,
their
most
powers were so
beautiful armor
far
I had
above
ever
them that
seen.
any attempt to
He
rebel
bound up
against
my
the Hollow
brother's
Men's
wrists,
request
put
would
him
be
on the back of
considered
the
treason.
strangest creature I
They
ever
don't
saw
even
come out of the
ask for a
woods,
weighty
and then he was
financial
gone.
tribute to keep the
There was
northern
no
border safe.
explanation about what
The
was done
king
with him.
ranted so
The
loudly
only
that
thing
he
I knew
spat
was
in
that he would
Rollo's
never come
face.
back and we would never
Torsten
hear
came
of him
from a long
again.
line of spitters.
What was the creature like?
One royal
Torsten
child
asked,
every 20
rushing for
years
details.
is a small
It
price
was like
to
a
pay.
dragon from a
I'd
fairy
send
tale.
one of you
It
to
had
each of
green
our enemies
scales,
in the south,
horns that parted
the
like
east,
an elk's,
and the
and
west if
fangs
that
that
would settle
protruded from his
things.
mouth.
Except
If
it
I had come
wouldn't.
across it in the woods,
A
I would
sounder
have run
lesson
rather
was
than try
never
to kill
taught.
it. What if it had a kinsfolk nearby? We would all have died. The knight had tamed it and rode a yellow beast, golden, of the same type. And you? Torsten asked. What do you remember about your brother? I remember him, the king insisted. I just don't like to talk about him. If I say anything at all, it feels like my father was wrong to send him away. I can't think my father's choice was wrong. Torsten nodded. I see. Grandfather can't be wrong because you have to do the same thing. The miserable, dejected look on his father's face immediately stripped the king of any regality he'd ever possessed in Torsten's eyes. When will the knight come for me? The young prince asked crossly. I don't know. Once the yellow bird appears, it could be any day. Torsten turned from his father and grasped the handle of the door. You're not going to try to run away, are you? The king asked, suddenly sounding like the victorious warlord Torsten had always believed him to be. The idea did cross the young man's mind. If you run, the king said, it will be an act of treason. You said you were willing to be a soldier for your country, and whether or not you were aware of it at the time, that pledge means you were willing to die for our kingdom. That's still true, isn't it? Torsten felt like spitting. I need what time is left to accustom myself to the idea. I'll prepare myself. If he was honest, Torsten didn't know what that meant. He had read the words he said to his father in a book, and that moment seemed like the correct place to insert them, but he didn't know if what he was saying was true. He hoped he'd be able to gain control of himself, but he didn't know if he could. He was too angry. I want you to know that what we're asking you to do is important. You know how many quarrels we have with the barbarians and the pagans. I do not need to come to blows with the Hollowmen. Is that what they're called? Torsten asked. It's what we call them because we aren't allowed to utter their true name. I don't even know it. Torsten bet they could fill a library with what his father didn't know. He nodded, kept his back to his father, and sped across the castle, knocking things over as he moved. He needed to check on his mother. He needed to hear what she thought of everything that was happening. She had obviously known his fate, and she had chosen his education and lessons accordingly. What was she thinking and feeling? He came to her bedroom doors, only to be met by several of her ladies in waiting. They instructed him that the queen was ill and she needed to be left alone to recover. He looked at their faces, each woman, and he suddenly felt sick. This was the part of the castle he knew best. These were servants he knew best. He had never once been denied entry to his mother's rooms. He might have been asked to wait as she changed her clothing. He might have been asked to return when she had awoken from her rest, but the way the women phrased their reply, he suddenly understood that his mother was not going to see him again before he left. For her, he was lost to her the moment the bird arrived. When she emerged from her bedroom, he would have been taken by the Knight of the Hollowmen. And that was why he was sitting in his window seat furious at everything and everyone. It was lucky he was an educated man, because he knew more curse words than the soldiers were taught in the army, and he could use them all to express himself quite accurately.